Let's go now to the UK and speak with Francesco Rizzuto, who's a professor of law at the University of East London. Good to have you back with us, Professor. Donald Trump himself seems to be managing expectations about this summit, doesn't he? Because initially he said that Putin was ready for a deal. Now he's hinting that this summit in Alaska is simply the first of possibly two or more meetings. What's your view on what Trump is expecting from this meeting with Putin?
Good morning. I think what he's expecting to discover is whether Putin has basically come to the conclusion that he has enough. In other words, he's holding enough and he's achieved enough given Trump's reaction. He wants to basically see whether Putin has understood that he's perhaps reached the limits of Trump's patience and that he's not going to get any more. I think that fundamentally that when Trump was talking about he'll know in 2 minutes, he'll know whether Putin, we're not talking about a long-term peace agreement here. We're basically talking about whether the guns are going to go silent. And I think he'll be able to discover that. He's right, a couple of minutes. And I think the rest of it was typical Trump, a roller coaster, change every 5 minutes or depending on who was interviewing him. So let's put all that aside. I think succinctly, he'll be able to tell in 2 or 3 minutes by the first utterances from Putin whether Putin actually now wants to stop the guns firing.
Listen, Professor, we're just looking at the presidential jet Air Force One now at Joint Base Andrews in Maryland. Donald Trump is shortly expected to board that jet to go to Alaska. I'm wondering if I can ask you about your thoughts on what Vladimir Putin might be thinking, because when you look at the messaging that's been coming out of Moscow in recent months, they seem fairly confident about the gains that Russia is making on the battlefield in its war with Ukraine. What would Vladimir Putin have to gain from this?
I think that if I were Putin, other than the fact that I said about 3 years ago that only if you're crazy that you will, that you would invade the Ukraine, and clearly I was wrong, and perhaps his sanity was not what I thought it was. I think if I was Putin, I would really say now, look, the total invasion of Ukraine has failed. We now hold 20% of the Ukraine, and actually we've connected up the Crimea, which we're never going to give up, with the rest of the underbelly of Russia, if you like. We've given the Ukrainians a bit of a bloody nose. We've had to take serious hits ourselves. Economically, things are not that a disaster, but they're not great. And actually, we have an American president who is unpredictable, who has threatened us now. And given his nature, he's not going to back off in terms of making things difficult for us economically. Let's change tack, hold on to what we've got, and develop our economic relations with the United States so that will free up certain things economically, and it'll make my regime a little bit less at risk, let me put it that way. So if I was Putin, that's what I would be thinking. But then remember, I'm probably slightly biased because I'm a Western European who tends to think about these things rationally. I'm not a driven nationalist, but that's what he should be thinking, frankly. The invasion of the Ukraine has not worked. There's not been a regime overthrow. And the West Europeans are reacting in ways that now appear to have got the Americans on side over ensuring that security in Europe is assured, even though we Europeans are having to pay for that, let's be clear. So if I was Putin, that's the kind of calculation that I would be making.
Yes, we know the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has been rallying European support ahead of this summit. I think European leaders have been watching on nervously, hoping to essentially make sure that whatever happens in Alaska, that Ukraine will ultimately have a say in any potential peace deal. Do you think Donald Trump has heeded that message about the fact that Ukraine needs to be involved in any ceasefire deal, and that security guarantees must also be discussed?
I think he has, but again, as long as he remains true to his last word on the matter, I think he's understood that there's no way that there can be a long-term ceasefire, let alone a peace treaty, without the involvement of the Ukrainians and perhaps on the side the Europeans. Though I think that the other Europeans, I wouldn't bet on it. So they will have to be involved in the discussion, and I think that's why he started to talk about uh, subsequent meetings to discuss the details of any ceasefire if that happens today, as I think it probably will. Though it may not be announced today, it will probably be announced if Trump has come to the view that Putin is ready now to basically call a halt to the conflict and to move on from it. As far as security concerns, well, we in Europe and the United States, we've got to be careful what we mean by providing the Ukrainians with security guarantees. Does that mean that we send troops? Well, clearly the Russians are against NATO troops, but do we send troops to the Ukraine? Okay, the coalition of the willing says yes, but are those troops simply going to monitor the ceasefire, a little bit like the monitoring process between North and South Korea, or does it mean that we will actually also intervene in the event the Russians do what the Ukrainians and some Europeans, certainly in the Baltic states, thinks they're going to do anyway in a few years' time? In other words, attack again. That means that we will be drawn into a conflict. These are things that have to be considered. And by the way, that's why Putin is offering, in order to allay fears, justifiably or not, allay fears over a future security in Europe by offering a future security pact with the Americans. But what about us Europeans?
Okay, Professor Francesco Rizzuto, we'll have to leave it there. Thanks as always for joining us. Really appreciate it.